even if you are suffering injustice, illness, death, grief, sorrow, if that moral action gives you something of worth, then you have to begin to ask yourself, where does that intrinsic worth of goodness come from? I was talking about how they transform every issue into issues of sensitivity and language instead of, for instance, truth, right? You want to get at the truth. And the truth is that there are trade-offs for everything. Everything comes at a price, and what they should be talking about is this is going to help this, but it's going to hurt this, and those are the ways you make decisions. But instead what they're doing is they're saying you're not being nice. And the worst example of this week came from Pope Francis. He was in, I think, Singapore. He was talking to an interreligious meeting with young people. And he was talking to them, and this is a quote from the transcript. One of the things that has impressed me, he says, is the interfaith dialogue. It's very important, he says, because if you start arguing, this is the Pope talking, if you start arguing my religion is more important than yours, or mine is the true one, yours is not true, where does this lead? And somebody shouts out the answer, a young person says it leads to destruction. And the Pope says, that is correct. All religions are paths to God. I will use an analogy. They are like different languages that express the divine. I wonder why the martyrs died. The early Christian martyrs died rather than pay tribute to the god Caesar if every religion is a path to God. You don't want to kill people over these things. I don't want to fight or hurt or hate people. But if you don't want to argue about them at all, if you don't want to discuss them, then it must be because they don't matter. It must be because they're not real. Now, listen, I believe that people of different religions can find their way to God, but I believe that if they do, the God they find is going to look exactly like Jesus Christ, okay? And I'm serious about that. I believe it's from Matthew 25 that there are people who can serve Christ without knowing it, and they will be a credit for Christ will welcome them. He'll say, you fed me and you clothed me, and they'll say, when? We didn't even know you. And he'll say, don't worry, when you did it to that beggar on the street, when you did it to that guy who was, being beaten up or whatever, then when you did it to the least of people, you were doing it to me. So you're good. I believe that. But it's always going to come down to Jesus Christ. And I believe that that process doesn't end when you die. I don't think it's a game show. I think if you're on the right trajectory, this is what, I don't know. Obviously I'm just talking from what I've read in the Bible and working it out for myself, but I do believe that the trajectory continues after death. If you're on the good trajectory, I don't think, your time's up and it's done. I could be wrong. Listen, take my advice. Jesus told the Samaritan woman, the Jews are in a good situation because they know who they worship. You worship what you do not know. It is better to worship what you know, which is why I think we should support our religion. So interfaith discussion doesn't have to be belligerent, just like politics doesn't have to be belligerent, but you do have to speak the truth fearlessly. So there's an article in First Things, which is a very fine Catholic-leaning journal that I subscribe to, one of the two journals that I subscribe to. And Orrin Cass, who's a very intelligent commentator, takes issues with conservatives who say we need to return to God to be free. He uses Josh Hawley as an example. Hawley says, America as we know it cannot survive without biblical Christianity. The rights we cherish, the freedoms we enjoy, the ideals we love together, all are rooted in and sustained by the tradition of the Bible. Christianity is the electric current of our national life. Turn it off and the light will fade. And Cass, like many, many, many conservatives, says no. He says the problem is that this view no longer fits the national character. We live in an era in which faith has fallen out of fashion. I don't suppose that is an especially controversial statement, but then he gives all the data showing that Americans no longer go to church and no longer believes. And Cass goes on, he says, and he's a good guy, he was on the show too, he's not being malevolent, he's giving his opinion. He says, on the social issues, conservatives have lost repeatedly and decisively as a religious argument based in Christian morality won in American politics in the past 50 years. I cannot think of one instance. We should understand religion not as the moral foundation upon which the nation's culture and morality are constructed, but as the form into which many ideas and much experience were poured, shaping them and holding them upright. In other words, the religion doesn't generate the morals, it holds the morals in a shape. It's kind of like a fiction that is selling the morals, like reading a novel that tells you what the morals are, but the morals aren't coming from God. Now, I have to tell you something. I've tried to build a moral system without God for 35 years, and I did it with all my mind and all my heart, and I tried very, very hard, and when I couldn't, I was absolutely certain that it could not be done, that you cannot build a moral system without God. Now, Cass goes on to say this. He says he doesn't believe that people have lost their faith because of scientism, the belief that science explains everything, that everything's material and can be explained by science. He believes it's because the meritocracy elevates reason over every other quality, and faith is not about reason. He says the modern meritocracy selects for those who are relatively more adept at reasoning and especially adept at getting their way through reason. This aptitude makes them hostile to faith, which might disrupt their monopoly on truth. But the fact is, it's scientism that has made people like Orrin Cass believe that reason and faith are at odds, which they aren't, right? It's an illusion that reason and faith are at odds, or that science and faith are at odds, which is why I want to point you to what I think is a groundbreaking article, one of the best articles I have read in the last several years, maybe even in a decade. And unfortunately, it is by my son, Spencer Klavan, no relation. And I say unfortunately because I feel a little bit like Ben defending Israel, and everybody says, of course you're defending Israel. You're a Jew who loves Israel. And you're going to say, well, this guy with a name like Klavan is probably related to you. And, it's not true. Obviously, we're not related. However, this kid is brilliant. The fact that the Ivy Leagues aren't fighting for him to be a professor there. This is a guy with a Yale undergraduate degree and an Oxford postdoctorate in classics. It's a brilliant guy, and he wrote in the Claremont Review of Books, which is the only other journal that I subscribe to, a review of the trilogy, The Three-Body Problem, which is a Chinese science fiction bestseller that was obviously made into a Netflix show by a guy named Liu Shaoxin. And Spencer writes about the fact that the novel is about a glitch in Newtonian physics. Okay, this is not that hard to understand. Using what we know in Newtonian physics, we can predict the trajectories and the reactions of any two objects in space, like the Earth and the Sun. We know the effect that the Earth is going to have on the Sun and the Sun is going to have on the Earth, and how it's going to make them move and what they're going to do to one another. And we can predict their effects using the math from Newton. But if you add a third object, it becomes impossible, and it seems random. It becomes impossible to predict what they will do, okay? That's the three-body problem. And that, if you've seen the Netflix show, I read the first book in the trilogy, and I saw the show, that's the problem that they're facing. How do we keep a civilization going when we never know what's going to happen next? The sun could burn up everything, or we could suddenly have an ice age, or everybody could be killed. How do we figure out to keep a society alive when you cannot predict what's going on? And what Spencer points out, something about the author of The Three-Body Problem, this guy Liu, he's not openly religious. He may not be religious at all, but like Nietzsche, he simply understands what happens when you remove religion, which is that the ability of the human mind to make sense of the world disappears beyond what we were evolved to do. We were evolved, if you believe wholly in evolution, no God, we were evolved to understand the savannah. And we can understand things for a while, but once they get too big or too small, they stop making sense to us because our mind is just randomly evolved to understand our situation, but not the real situation. Spencer writes, the scientific enterprise that gave us rockets and nuclear power was fueled at its outset by the belief that whatever we found among the stars would gel with what we had learned on Earth. Absent that belief, there's no reason to expect that the furthest reaches of the universe will answer to the postulates of human minds. In other words, science was invented in the Christian world because the Christian world believed that we were made in God's image, and his sense was going to be discernible by our sense. And what is happening now is we've reached a moment when quantum physics, very small things, and three-body problems, very large things, don't make sense to us. And if we don't have the faith that we can understand all these things because we are made in the image of God, we can't move forward. Science will simply cease. And Spencer concludes, perhaps the only situation to this problem is the one Liu finds hardest to countenance. Perhaps the only way out of the dark forest is the one illuminated by the belief that led us up to this point. That belief that we are not merely haphazard brains coughed up by evolution, but souls shaped to know the universe and its creator. That belief wasn't a result of experimental investigation. It was the inspiration that prompted us to experiment in the first place. So, in other words, it's not just the social order that requires faith, it's order itself, it's sense, logic, science itself. And they tell you, oh, follow the science, not the religion. There is no science after a while without religion. Without religion, things will stop making sense. This is about science, and we Most of us don't understand the details of quantum science and three-body problems and all this, but all of us do understand that there's a logical breakdown for ordinary people too, which is called theodicy. It's the breakdown when we try to understand why there is suffering and evil in a world made by an omniscient, all-powerful, good God. We find it hard to understand. So Bill Maher was talking to Jordan Peterson about this. It was kind of like being in one of Jordan Peterson's clinical sessions. And this is what Maher said about this, that this idea that good things happen to good people and bad things happen to bad people is simply ridiculous. Here's what Maher said.
When people connect their behavior with some sort of punishment or reward, that's childish. That's what, when people go karma, I did a whole thing on this on my show once. What a bunch of karma. Americans interpret karma to mean like, you took the last parking spot and now it's going to happen to you. That's Schadenfreude. That's not karma. But that's how people think of it. Karma. Oh, yeah, it's going to come back and get you. No, I'm
karma,
sorry.
Weaponized karma.
Weaponized karma. No, life is random. Good people get punished for no reason, and bad people go unpunished.
Now, Maher I respect what he's saying here, but he's using the wrong word, right? He's not quite right. At the human level, the world is not random. It's unjust. It's not random at all. If you eat a lot of cake, you'll get fat. If you don't work out, you'll get flabby. If you cheat and lie and steal, you'll become one kind of person. And if you're kind and moral and loving, you'll become another kind of person. These things just follow as the night follows the day. But to Maher's point, you can do good and get hit by a car or cancer, or get unfairly treated by powerful people and put in prison. So the question then becomes, will the fact that those good or bad actions don't save you from injustice and suffering, human or natural, does that make the goodness worthless? That's the question that you're really answering. If it does make it worthless, if the goodness is worthless, you should just do whatever you want, whatever helps you survive. You should lie when you can get away with it. You should cheat. You could kill if you can get away with it. Whatever you want to do, you should do. And if you lie and lie and lie, if nothing else, you get a job in the news media. But if not, if your goodness has an intrinsic worth, if it does something to the inside of you and shapes your soul in such a way that it elevates your life even when you are suffering, even if you are suffering injustice, illness, death, grief, sorrow, still, if that moral action gives you something of worth, then you have to begin to ask yourself, where does that intrinsic worth of goodness come from? If it doesn't come from rewards and punishments, which it doesn't, Maher is right, why is goodness worth it even if you suffer? And how is it that deep down, all of us actually understand the beauty of goodness, even in a world of evil when we see it? You can move people with it instantaneously, even if they're evil themselves. And if you follow that train of thought that there's an inherent goodness that doesn't stop you from suffering in the world, you begin to understand the God who gives that goodness its worth. It's the only way you can get to that understanding. And once you think about that long enough, you start to realize that a God who walked into the world would be crucified by that world, that's the whole point. But that God would live forever even so. The truth would be destroyed, but the truth would never die. There's only one religion that teaches that, not as a myth, but as a historical fact. And just as we need that religion to understand the physical universe, we actually can't do science without it. We also need it to understand the moral universe as well. And on that too, we should not remain silent. For more great content, like and subscribe, and please subscribe to The Andrew Klavan Show wherever you get your podcasts.